That was a very good synopsis of your work, and I think we get a lot out of that. We still have some more time. Going back to the whole thing of the preferred reading and the structured text, or not totally structured text, but still. And I guess it's a question about ideology, and you know, there is so much discussion now about the way that people negotiate or have oppositional readings or somehow manage the ideological messages that is inscribed in these things. I mean, how do you square that with the kind of work that you do? I mean, do you find that people actually negotiate with the ideology that's there? I mean, it's not clearly formulated, but what I'm trying to get at is really this point of the way that ideology works, and the way that people react to those messages.
Well, you see, in one sense, I think that's a version of the only interesting question there is about the mass media, which is ultimately a question about power. But there is there are various problems. I mean, the first one is that when you consider it sociologically, that schema derived from Chapter 3 of Frank Parkin's book on class inequality and political order, you know, kind of dominant, negotiated and oppositional meaning systems, which become then, as it were, deified as the three codes of audience studies. And that's a hell of a crude model, yes, that there are only three types of meaning systems in a society, yeah? And the problem with the way it's often used in theories of the audience is, of course, that if you think about it logically, it's enormously crude. All the model says is either the sender and the receiver of the message share, partly share, or don't share at all, the same code. And there's a built-in presumption that the mass media can only produce messages in dominant code. You know, it's a kind of very enormously simplistic model. Now, if you say to me, is that what I find people doing? Well, I suppose I don't think it's a very good description of what people do. Heuristically, 18 years ago, it was a damn good place to start from, it seemed. But I think what one has to work towards is a kind of much more finely grained analysis, which gets away from the presumption that the broadcast media can only produce things in something called dominant code, whatever that might be, because that's simply not true. It's a question of extent at any given moment. But B, one is going to have to start kind of breaking down the schema, because in a sense, a fully kind of dominant reading and a fully oppositional reading are simply kind of extreme cases, yeah? They're kind of markers. Everything is in the middle. What's of interest is, as it were, the varieties of negotiation and the varieties of negotiated code. That's the only interesting category. You have to work with that. Now, one of the things that I suppose, increasingly think about is that while I want to retain very much the notion that messages are indeed structured, do have preferred readings built into them and so on, people, when reading, are being nudged, you know, read it this way, you know, there are built-in cues and so on, okay, fine. But it's not only the internal structure of a given message, like the program you're watching or the film you're watching, which is at stake, because you're also dealing with a much broader framework of, like, you know, the marketing, the advertising, the film poster you saw, the film you saw before by the same director that made you think you're going to see this film, when you saw the guy who's the star interviewed on the kind of chat show on the television, what your girlfriend said to you about, you know, any number of inputs which are kind of also working on this moment of interaction between reader and text. Now, I think one of the very interesting developments that I suppose I should more properly say one of the things that I've become aware of more recently, it's developed long before I began to understand the tradition, is the kind of anthropological work on symbolic consumption. So when someone like Daniel Miller in Material Culture and Mass Consumption talks about marketing and, as it were, the differential opportunity for creative uses of consumer objects as between different categories of consumer objects and different objects within those categories with reference to marketing structures and so on. I think then we begin to open up very rich terrain where we can begin to see differences, whether you phrase it as different forms of negotiated decoding or different forms of creative or manipulative or innovative consumption, or however you want to do it. But everything is in those varieties of negotiation, in a sense. The dominant and the oppositional, they're simply logical markers